Hi, my name is James Johnson. I'm the creator of this merge request. I wanted to explain some of the intentions of this merge request and some of the background behind it, and also speak about a few of the areas impacted by these code changes. So I prepared a few slides to go over these concepts. So this merge request is all about the CVE request process. So we'll go through this pretty quickly and then talk about some of the code changes in the merge request. So a CVE is a common vulnerability enumeration. CVE identifiers are unique identifiers assigned to a specific vulnerability that affects specific version ranges of a project. So for example, given this test project, version 1.2.3, there's two vulnerabilities in the code. If a user has this test project, version 1.2.3 as a dependency, how can they know that those vulnerabilities exist? And the answer is relies on the maintainer. The maintainer needs to know about the vulnerabilities, be aware of them, and can request CVE identifiers for those vulnerabilities in their own project. And CVE identifiers look something like this. Usually the 1111s are replaced by the current year, and they are unique to that vulnerability. Each vulnerability has metadata associated with it, including the affected versions, the fixed versions, and a description of the vulnerability, among a few other things. So if the user is using a dependency scanner and the test project maintainer has had CVE identifiers assigned to those known vulnerabilities, the dependency scanner will be able to detect that a vulnerable version of the test project is being used. And it will look something like this. Dependency scanners will also be able to use the metadata associated with those CVE IDs to recommend a course of action to correct, a course of action so that the user won't be using a vulnerable instance of the test project. And the solution in this case is to upgrade to version 2 or above. So the user will see that and upgrade their dependency to version 2 or above. Now, this merge request specifically focuses on the maintainer side of things. So let's talk a little bit about that. A maintainer needs to work with a CNA, a CVE numbering authority. That is an organization that is able to assign or issue CVE identifiers for projects within their scope. And a maintainer works with them and submits to a CNA a request for a new CVE identifier. At that stage, the CNA then validates the request, assigns a CVE ID, and then publishes CVE metadata at the right time. So GitLab is a CNA. The team that I'm a part of, the vulnerability research team, basically triages incoming CVE requests and does the CVE assignment. So our scope is public projects hosted on GitLab.com. So often, vulnerabilities that are reported to maintainers, they are reported within confidential issues on the project. That is also how maintainers track discussions and fixes for the vulnerability. Now, I bring this up because this merge request is intended to fit within this workflow that maintainers are often used to. And so let's say I'm a user, I'm this user of test project, and I created this issue reporting a vulnerability in the buffer overflow function. I'm asking the maintainer to please fix it. So I create the issue, I tell the maintainer about it. Now the maintainer needs to create a CVE request and send it to us, GitLab, in our role as a CNA. And then we validate the request, go back and forth with the user, get all the required information, and we issue a CVE identifier for that vulnerability. Then the maintainer is able to use that CVE ID in their release notes and the changelog, however they wish. On our end, as a CNA, we would also publish the metadata about that CVE as soon as the maintainer says it is okay to do so. Now, this merge request specifically adds this CVE ID request button in the issue sidebar. So going back to this slide where often security vulnerabilities are reported to maintainers inside of confidential issues. this merge request is intended to fit within that process, where a confidential issue has been created and the maintainer is able to directly request a CVE ID for that reported security vulnerability. So clicking this button takes you to a new issue page on GitLab org CVEs. This is where we track our published CVE assignments, and is also the entry point to our internal CNA workflow. And this is an example of a CVE ID request that was created from that test project. And this is some of the metadata that is collected from the maintainer. So the CVE request issue is our means of communication with the maintainer, and we go back and forth with the maintainer, collecting information and validating things that they've said. And this is how we also notify the maintainer of status updates. All right, so before we talk specifically about those code changes, I did want to show this in action. So this is that sample issue from the slides, and I'm looking at this issue from the perspective of the maintainer. So this is a public project hosted on, well, it's my local development instance, but gitlab.com. And it is a confidential issue, and I'm a maintainer. For all of those reasons, this button shows up in the sidebar. And it has some useful help information, which then links to the documentation. And this talks about everything that we just talked about, why you might want to request a CVE identifier, when it applies, and what to expect once you start that process. Additionally, the button itself can be disabled inside of the project settings, and that is talked about in this documentation. It defaults to on and does only show up within that limited set of circumstances. All right, so going back to the slides, so it does add the request button in the issue sidebar, or this merge request does that, which involves view component changes as well as Rails or Ruby helper code for the view components, so that we can know if we're on gitlab.com, if the current user is a maintainer, and if the issue is confidential. In order to track the project settings, so if we go here, general, and settings, here's this field, enable CVE ID requests in the issue sidebar. In order to track this state, that requires database changes. We needed a new database column. There are documentation changes for the feature itself, as well as for the settings page, and I just showed you that. And there are also API changes on the normal API and GraphQL. Normal API. And those you can see here, and this is on the just normal GraphQL API resources. This is the automatically generated documentation from the GraphQL schema. That's taken a while to load. We'll come back to that. And this also shows up in the GraphQL Explorer. So if you look at the project, object, or model inside of the GraphQL Explorer, you will also see it in here. So CVE ID request enabled, and this loaded CVE, and it's here too. Yeah, that's about it. It has a pretty simple goal and intention. In the future though, we are planning on expanding on this a little bit more. So instead of the maintainer having to fill out the form inside of the issue description, we would create a pop-up dialog when the button is clicked, or something similar, to capture that data directly from the maintainer. And at that stage, we could also include components to help the maintainer calculate the correct CWE and CVSS vectors to include with their CVE request. In addition, we would be wanting in the future to integrate with the vulnerability dashboard. But those are not included in this merge request, but it does help to understand the direction that this could go. Yeah, that is about it. Thank you for your time, and I hope that helps.